With no new episodes of the Amazon Prime cartoon The Legend of Vox Machina this week, you may be looking to go back and watch the original source material, Critical Role. The only problem? You've never played D&D before, aren't sure you necessarily want to dive into the world of TTRPG, and you feel intimidated trying to watch the game without understanding at least the basics of the rules. Or perhaps you've got a friend who has told you to check out Dimension 20. They say it's funny, it's heartfelt, it's epic! That all sounds great to you, until you realize Dimension 20 is, mostly, a D&D show, and you feel overwhelmed with trying to understand the game mechanics and the story at the same time. Or perhaps you've experienced something similar with one of the many great D&D shows or podcasts that are out there. Shows like The Adventure Zone, Rivals of Waterdeep, The Black Dice Society, High Rollers, Ox Venture, and so many more. You might even be interested in checking out the D&D show right here on our own channel, The Gilded City. Whatever the case may be, if you want to start watching D&D shows, but you don't know anything about how the game works, this guide is for you. Note that this is more of a basic guide specifically for people who just want to watch or listen to a D&D show. It is not a guide for learning how to actually play the game. There are already a ton of great resources out there for people who want to start playing D&D, and I'll link to a few of those in the description. With all that being said, my name is Ben, and here's what you need to know to follow gameplay in a D&D actual play show. Let's start with the absolute basics. What even is Dungeons & Dragons? Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, is a special type of game called a tabletop role-playing game, or TTRPG for short, and is probably the most famous and well-known. There are lots of great TTRPGs out there, and there are a number of shows focused on other games besides D&D. That said, I will be focusing specifically on the most recent version of D&D in this guide. Some of what I say will be applicable to other games, but not all TTRPGs, so keep that in mind. So what makes D&D and TTRPGs in general different from other types of games? Tabletop role-playing games are essentially a system for group storytelling. You get a group of people together, and each person in the group plays one or more characters in a story that the group as a whole tells together. We'll get into the specific roles of different players a bit later, but this basic concept that everyone contributes to a broader story you tell together is the core of the D&D experience. Some stories can be told over the course of only a couple of play sessions. Some are much longer, requiring many play sessions over months or even years. As long as the people around the table, literal or proverbial, are showing up and engaging in the process of telling the story together, the game continues. This story is typically cooperative. Unlike many games played around a table, rather than competing with your fellow players, you are working together to tell the most satisfying story possible. TTRPGs are not the only kinds of cooperative tabletop games out there, but if your primary experience of playing a game with others is Monopoly, or Uno, or poker, or Parcheesi, or any other number of traditional competitive tabletop games, this can be a difficult concept to grasp. There is no winner of D&D per se. If everyone is having fun telling the story, then everyone is winning. Of course, what makes D&D a game, rather than a group of people just telling a story together, is the rules and the ever-present chance of failure. In a book, movie, TV show, or other traditional storytelling medium, the creators of the product have decided in advance what's going to happen. The outcome is determined long before the product is put in front of you, and setbacks and successes are usually designed to serve the story. But in D&D, the story has to mold itself to successes and failures. In D&D, dice decide successes and failures. Some TTRPGs use other systems. There's one called Dread that even uses a game of Jenga to determine success and failure. But all TTRPGs involve some game mechanic for determining success and failure of actions the different players take. So, in short, D&D is group storytelling with dice that help determine whether actions taken by the characters in the story succeed or fail. With this description, hopefully you now understand why watching or listening to other people's D&D games is such a popular new form of entertainment with actual play or real play shows. These terms simply refer to the idea that you are experiencing people actually playing the game, rather than watching or listening to them summarize the story of the game. If you've made it this far, and you feel like you have enough of a grasp on the idea to go out and start watching a D&D actual play, great! Go find a show that you want to watch and enjoy. But if you feel like you need a little more information before you feel comfortable watching the game, stay tuned, because we've got a little bit more to cover. So, for the most part, D&D groups tend to involve 4 to 6 players, though you can play D&D with as few as 2 players and as many as you as a group feel like you can reasonably manage. In the story that you're telling as a team, different players fill different roles. Most of the players of the game control one single character. They guide that character's actions and decide what they do moment to moment. These characters, who are directly controlled by one single player, are called player characters, or PCs. PCs have a few different aspects for their players to keep track of. Each player decides on their character's background. Who were they before the adventure? What led them to this point? What's their name? What's their lineage? Are they a human, elf, dwarf, orc, halfling, or some other fantasy lineage? When a player is creating their character, they think about all of these things and more. Player characters also have something called a class, which the player decides when creating their character. We won't go into too much detail on what every class is and what it does. The main takeaway that you need to know about class is that a character's class basically decides what they can do. Are they good at fighting? Are they good at talking to other people? Are they good at magic? Are they good at being sneaky? These are the sorts of things that a character's class helps determine. One of the players, however, fills a different role. This special player is called the Dungeon Master, DM, or Game Master, GM. Some people prefer one term over the other, or a different term altogether, and each term for this player has its merits, but today we'll just use DM. The DM is a special player who performs several different functions. The DM describes and manages the world the other players perform actions in, is in charge of judging the rules, designs challenges and adventures for other players to overcome, and plays all the other characters in the world that aren't controlled by one of the other players. Because of the DM's perceived more intensive role, some people may think of the DM as the sole storyteller, but this isn't really true. Every player's actions and choices spin the story off in new, interesting, and unpredictable directions. D&D is truly group storytelling. Okay, so we've covered who the players are and what they do, but what's up with the dice? D&D uses several different types of dice, but the most important and frequently used kind is the 20-sided die, which we usually call a D20. The way play works is that a player describes what their character would like to do. The DM will then decide how difficult accomplishing that action would be. The DM may decide that the player automatically succeeds or automatically fails, in which case they won't have the player roll the D20 at all, just simply describe what happens and move on. But in most cases, the DM will decide how difficult the action is and pick a number called a difficulty class, or DC. The higher the number, the more difficult it is to accomplish that task. Sometimes the DM will tell the player what the DC is, but usually they won't. After the DM has decided on the DC, they will ask the player to make an appropriate ability check to see if they succeed or fail. It'll be a different type of ability that's called for depending on the circumstances of the roll. The player will then roll their d20, and depending on their individual character, may add or even subtract a number from the result of their roll. If the final result is equal to or higher than the number the DM decided on, the player succeeds. If it is less than the number the DM decided, they fail. Let's look at an example. One of the characters in the campaign on this channel, the Gilded City, is named Artemis. Artemis is a very charismatic person and is good at talking to other people and convincing them to do things. Let's say that Artemis is trying to convince a character controlled by me, the DM. Let's say this character's name is Brian. So let's say Artemis is trying to convince Brian to give him important information. Now, I decide that Brian doesn't feel totally comfortable giving Artemis this information, but he does like Artemis. So with these two factors in mind, I decide that the difficulty is going to be 15, and ask Artemis to make a persuasion check to see if he's able to convince Brian to do this thing for him. Okay, so Artemis got a 17. Now, Artemis is really good at persuasion, so he gets to add 10 to his roll. This gives him a total of 27, much higher than the 15 difficulty I decided on. So he succeeds, and Brian agrees to give him information. And that is basically how the dice work. These sorts of rolls determine most actions in the game, from convincing other people to do things for you, to climbing up a difficult slope, to keeping your footing on an unstable surface, to hitting an opponent during a fight. Something special happens if a player rolls a 20 on their die. We call that a natural 20, and naturally, it's the absolute best a player can do on a roll. In combat, this means that the attacker got a critical hit, which does extra damage. Technically speaking, a natural 20 is only special in combat, but most DMs and players also treat it specially outside of combat, allowing for extra success on the thing the player was attempting to do. On the flip side is the natural 1, which is the absolute worst a player can do on a roll. In combat, this is treated as an automatic miss, and some DMs even make extra negative effects happen. Just like the natural 20, technically speaking, a natural 1 is only special in combat, but most players and DMs treat it as an automatic failure outside of combat too. Of course, there are other types of dice used for D&D, but they are not used nearly as much as the D20. For the most part, the other dice are used to calculate damage amounts during combat when an attack or a spell hits. And that should be enough to get you or a friend started watching D&D actual plays. I hope that this guide was helpful, and if you're looking for a D&D show recommendation, might I humbly suggest you check out the Gilded City right here on this YouTube channel. Are there any other parts of the game you want to know more about? Let me know in the comments below, and we might do future guides like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.